Well, welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Keith Nunes. I'm the editor of Food Business News, and we're a business-to-business platform that covers the food and beverage industry. And I have to tell you, I'm very happy to be moderating this session because the market for meat alternatives is one of our most popular topics. Whenever we run a story, I can see the engagement among our audience, and stories about the meat alternative market always rank within our top 5. And I think the reason is everybody recognizes there's a lot of potential. But as we've learned in the last few years, there are also a lot of challenges. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So what I want to do is just give you a brief overview of how this is going to work. First off, we're going to have a presentation from Neeru Ravi, who's a principal with the Boston Consulting Group. She's going to talk about the market for meat alternatives, where we've been, where we are, where we may be going. Then we're going to open it up to our panel. And let me introduce our panel. First off, we have Akiro A.K. Agogame, who is Senior Vice President of Global Marketing at Beyond Meat, one of the leaders in the plant-based meat space. Next, we have Elizabeth Gutschenritter, is Managing Director of Alternative Proteins at Cargill, which is one of the world's largest food companies. Next, we have Jennifer DiFrancesco, is Director of Culinary Innovation at Sodexo Campus, where she leads the development of student menus and works to achieve Sodexo's commitment to make 50% of their menu offerings plant-based by 2050. And finally, we have Scott May, who's the founder and head of MISTA, which is Givaudan's innovation platform that helps large and small companies. So Neeru's going to lead off. We're going to have a panel discussion with our panelists. Then we're going to open it up to Q&A. And so if you have questions, please submit them through the Swap Card app, and we'll get to them towards the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll invite Neeru to come up and give her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. Before I dive in, I wanted to just share a bit of brief context about BCG for those who might not be as familiar with us. So we're a global leading management consulting firm, and climate is one of our top strategic priorities, and food systems and alternative proteins are a key pillar within that. We work with organizations across the agri-food value chain, from consumer packaged goods companies to retailers to quick service restaurants, all the way through to startups and farmer cooperatives. We published several thought leadership articles on the alternative protein space in recent years, and many of you might have seen some of these. They're all linked in the notes for this event in the app, so please take a look. I'll just call out a few highlights, and then I'll dive into some of the insights from the research. So in our first paper in 2011, we sized the total global alternative protein market and developed some growth projections. A key takeaway was that we predicted that by 2035, the market would be worth $290 billion with 11% share of the total protein market. In the follow-up to that in 2022, we assessed the climate impact of this growth, and we identified that this market growth has the potential to deliver about a gigaton of carbon dioxide emission savings, which is worth about $50 to $80 billion in avoided emissions. And in our report published earlier this year, we discussed how we can really live into this market opportunity and climate opportunity by winning with the mainstream consumer, and we offer a 4-step approach to do that. And I'll dive into that in a bit more detail. So before I go into the behavioral insights, I wanted to touch briefly on the market data. So let's look at the latest data on the US alternative protein retail market. And what you see here is the actual retail sales annually from 2019 through to 2022. The green bar is dairy and the yellow bar is alternative meat. For For 2023, given we're in the middle of the year, we've just taken the last 52 weeks worth of data, and this doesn't include food service. So just given this data, obviously there's been some ups and downs in the growth, and if we looked with the last year, 2022, to the last 52 weeks from August, it suggests a decline from last year. So it was up 9% last year, trending a little bit flat/down since then, with dairy continuing to grow but at a slightly slower pace than last year, and alternative meats further declining. And when we look at the data one click further, we see that the decrease is actually driven by a decrease in units, whilst there's been increase in price, but not as steeply as the price increases of last year. So there's many drivers of some of that slowdown, and the goal of this panel and this conversation is how do we unlock that future growth. I'm sure many of you in the audience also have perspectives on what's driving that, the market and what's affecting the growth, but a couple of thoughts that to kick off the conversation. So first, I think we know that there's been some channel shifts given the pandemic, so from grocery to food service. Second, obviously, the inflationary environment affects prices and consumer willingness to spend. Thirdly, there's been a lot of new brands in this category. I think there's been some consumer questions and concerns about quality and also other factors of the product. And then lastly, there's a difference between how companies have been approaching alternative proteins and positioning their products and the needs of the consumers in this category. And we call this a communication or a marketing mismatch, and this is actually something that could be driving one of these factors. Now, if you look across all of these, many of these require a lot more structural changes, but this last one, in terms of the communication mismatch, is something that has a lot of near-term actionability, and that's where I really want to dive in with all of you today, and it's something that companies can really look to in the near term to unlock some of that market growth. So whilst many companies will be thinking about approaching alternative proteins from a climate perspective, and I know there's some other sessions over this conference talking about that climate impact, when we think about the consumer, we have to think about their attitudes towards sustainability, because ultimately all of these products are sold in that kind of B2C context. So let's talk about that consumer. At BCG, we conducted a survey of over 3,000 consumers globally to understand what their motivations are when it comes to buying fresh food products and also their attitudes towards sustainability. So what you see here is that 20% of the consumers, the unconcerned consumers, are not thinking about this sustainability at all when it comes to their purchases. Another 20%, that core consumer group, do care about sustainability, and they're making purchase decisions based on this fact. And then 60% of consumers, so that mainstream bucket, they say they care about sustainability, but they're not taking decisions based on sustainability. They have other needs that matter more to them and that are driving their purchase choices. And for us to really win and grow with that mainstream consumer, we need to think about what those needs are and how we position and communicate to meet those needs. So let's dive into what those needs are. So on the left-hand side here, you see some data from a survey asking consumers about their needs when buying fresh food. And what you see here is that health and taste are the top two needs that come up. On the right-hand side is data from a survey asking consumers about their needs when buying alternative protein. And again, the top three here are taste, nutritional value, and health. So across this space, when it comes to that mainstream consumer, health and taste really emerge as the top needs driving behavior, and sustainability doesn't really come up as something that matters to these consumers. However, what's really interesting is that there's been a decreasing association between alternative proteins and meat and health and taste. So what you see on this page is some data from social media conversations. So on the left-hand side, this is data on conversations that link alternative proteins with terms like taste and health, and you'll see that conversations on those topics has decreased. And then on the right-hand side, you see that the conversations about alternative meats and more negative terms like processed or complex has increased. And so this suggests that there's that potential marketing mismatch or communication mismatch between what the needs of the consumers are and what is being, communicated to them or how they are talking about it. So what can we do about this? Well, we analyzed over 100 behavioral science academic studies to identify a series of tactics that companies can take on their front of pack messaging to really communicate and meet those consumer needs. And we focus on front of pack because this is where marketing real estate is limited, but these insights are really applicable across touch points with this mainstream consumer. So of these 4 strategies, 2 are quick wins, which means that they're relevant pretty much across the board. They're straightforward to implement. And these are limiting vegan and vegetarian labeling, and 2, really clearly identifying the alternative protein source. 2 of them, we're calling them more occasion-dependent practices because these require a detailed understanding of who the target consumer is and what their needs are in the occasion for which they're shopping. And these 2 are highlighting the product sensory appeal and highlighting the health benefits. So to give you an example of what I mean by an occasion-dependent practice, let's say that you have a product that's supposed to be in an indulgent occasion. So someone wants something that's really delicious and tasty and they don't really care about it being that healthy, then you're highlighting the product sensory appeal is going to resonate a lot more than necessarily highlighting the positive health benefits. So that's what I mean there. But I'll dive into each one of these 4 in a little bit more detail and show you how this applying these has some really tangible business benefits. So the first one on limiting vegan or vegetarian labeling, I think the rationale here is that vegans, vegetarians make up a very small proportion of the total US consumers. So if we're really trying to reach that mainstream consumer and unlock growth, we need to think about them more broadly. And in fact, there's actually some risks to focusing too much on vegan and vegetarian labeling. Firstly, using an identity-based label can sometimes create a bit of a psychological barrier. And also, in fact, from some of GFI's research in collaboration with MindLab, we see that this term is also associated with lower purchase intent compared to terms like plant-based. And also, when we explicitly asked consumers about this, they reported that this wasn't particularly important to them or compelling. So instead, what we recommend is using terms like does not contain animal products or 100% plant-based, which conveys the same message, but without using that identity label. Our next quick win is identifying the alternative protein source. So if you see the chart on the left-hand side, where the protein source was identified on a product, consumers gave it a higher overall rating relative to when it just said protein. And obviously there's some differences based on type of protein, but I think the main takeaway here is that specifying the protein source is always associated with higher ratings than not specifying it. And interestingly, when the protein source is specified, it also drives higher taste scores and health scores as well. And you can do this not just with labels, but also with visuals, images, etc. And interestingly, one company who implemented this saw about a 40% increase in sales when they went from having when they went to clearly identify the protein source versus just saying that it was protein or veggie. So it really has some tangible business benefits. So next we'll talk about the first occasion-dependent practice, which is highlighting the product sensory appeal. So when you have a product that really delivers on some aspect of that sensory experience, like taste or texture, or even the emotional enjoyment of eating it, then highlighting that on the front of the pack can really drive choice. So the chart on the left-hand side here shows the results of a study that looked at changing the labels of plant-based dishes. So in one condition, it was just labeled using a factual statement, green beans. And in another, it used a bit more of that indulgent sensory labeling, sweet sizzling green beans. And that drove 25% higher choice. And there's evidence to suggest that this holds true for plant-based analog products, not just vegetable dishes. And on packaging, in addition to just that labeling, you can use images to convey that sensory experience. And this can also drive positive taste associations, overall appeal, and purchase intent too. Finally, the last occasion-dependent practice is highlighting the positive health benefits. And the word positive here really matters because research shows that consumers respond a lot more to health claims that are positive rather than using restrictive language. So, for example, saying high protein versus low calorie. And what we're recommending here is going beyond just sharing the nutritional information, like 10 grams of protein, for example, and making a claim around great source of protein. And of course, there's regulation around this so on the nutritional profile that needs to hold true for some of these claims, so the product obviously needs to deliver on it to hold true. And we see that including these kinds of positive health benefits on the front of pack increases the willingness to consume the product, the perceived quality, and interestingly has a halo effect on increasing the perceived sustainability as well. So those are the 4 best practices, and alternative dairy actually is an interesting case study for seeing how this can be put into practice. So we looked at the front of pack messaging for the top 25 alternative dairy brands, and 88% of them are implementing at least 2 of these 4 best practices. So, for example, using terms like dairy-free instead of vegan, identifying the protein source with images, emphasizing that indulgent sensory experience through words like rich and creamy, and also highlighting positive health benefits like calcium content or omega-3, etc. However, when we look at the top 25 alternative meat brands and what they're doing on their front of pack messaging, only 56% of them are implementing at least two of these best practices. A lot of them are limiting vegan and vegetarian labeling, but relatively few are identifying the protein source, highlighting the positive health benefits, and even fewer of them are emphasizing that sensory appeal. Now, why does this matter? Well, when we look at the actual performance of these brands, and what you see here is the retail sales relative to 2019, we see really tangible business performance differences between these companies. So brands that are using at least 2 or more of these best practices have outperformed others by a factor of 6. And of course, there's many other drivers that could be affecting this beyond just that front of pack messaging and marketing, but this analysis suggests that there's real value in thinking through that front of pack messaging and applying some of these insights from behavioral science to drive that consumer behavior. So to summarize, there's 4 things that we would recommend companies do to really put these insights into practice. The first is to deeply understand the consumer needs, especially in that target occasion. So whether that's a healthy breakfast or an indulgent dinner, where are these products being consumed, and how can we really understand the consumer needs in that occasion? The second is continuing to innovate where we need to break down some of those barriers where consumers perceive there to be gaps relative to conventional products. And in the meantime, really tailoring and nuancing that messaging to meet the needs of those consumers, whether that be on health or taste, and thinking beyond sustainability as a key message. And leveraging those for behavioral science tested best practices. And then finally, really rigorously testing and learn into those strategies with a focus on what consumers do versus what they say. when we saw those mainstream consumers before, 60% of the market, they said they care about sustainability, but they weren't really taking decisions based on it. So there's that gap between say and do. And so really testing based on how consumers behave is critical here. So with that, I'll pause and hand back to Keith for the rest of the panel discussion, and I welcome any questions afterwards as well. Thank you.
You've given us a lot to think about and some real tactics to consider. And opening up the panel discussion, AK, I'd like to start with you. Thinking about the mismatches in consumer perception, what does that tell you about where the plant-based meat consumer is today?
Hello? There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. That's a great question. I would say that the plant-based meat consumer today is likely a bit more confused than they've ever been before. Neeru talked a bit about some of the changes in perception around taste and health. We've seen that there's a lot of noise out there right now. There's more social chatter that you'll find on posts that we make as well as posts across the category where consumers are asking questions about whether or not plant-based meat is truly healthy for them, whether or not these products are over-processed, whether these products are coming from sources that they can't really ascertain. We actually found when we did primary research that the number one reason why the general plant-based meat or the category consumer is consuming our product is because of clean eating. This perception that the product is actually clean, better for them. For those people that are opting out or leaving the category, they're leaving because that perception isn't necessarily something that they understand to be true anymore. So I do think that there's an erosion happening within the category, but it's, I should say, there's a household penetration erosion that's happening. But I do believe that it can be offset by doing a lot of what Neeru mentioned before. It's really changing the way that we're communicating to these consumers, identifying them, meeting them where they are, and then helping to combat misinformation with truth and fact.
Perfect, thanks. And Neeru, a quick follow-up, because I was interested in the fact you talked about companies are marketing that sustainability attribute, but consumers may not be responding to it. So can you talk a little bit about where does sustainability fit in the messaging in the marketplace?
Great question. I think when we go back to those consumer segments, that 20% of consumers who are our core consumers care about sustainability and they're taking actions based on it. So when companies put sustainability-focused messaging, it's hitting that core consumer group, but that's just 20% of the market, and you're already sort of preaching to the choir there because they already care about this. I think when it comes to that mainstream group, they care about sustainability, so your sustainability-focused messaging will be interesting to them, but it's not going to drive their behavior. And if we have, limited marketing real estate, limited marketing budgets, I think it makes more sense to really focus on landing those key messages of health and taste with that mainstream consumer versus trying to land those messages of sustainability.
And Jennifer, a question for you. In your role at Sodexo, you're working hands-on with a huge variety of products. What do you look for in plant-based products, and what factors do you find most important in encouraging students to consume plant-based products?
I think when we come to plant-based products, it's really looking at the same things we would with any product, right? You need to have your taste there, that flavor profile. You're looking at texture, the mouthfeel of something. You're also looking at the appearance. It has to replicate what it's trying to be like. So all of those factors are certainly into play. And when we look at Gen Z, we know that they're gravitating towards several different factors when choosing plant-based products. They're looking at it for their health and wellness. They are looking for it for animal welfare. Some of them are looking at it from an environmental standpoint. But then there's this other factor, which I call like the coolness factor. There's their discovery and affinity for flavor discovery. And we found out that 51% of Gen Z try new foods simply because it sounds interesting to them. So we find that that's a great opportunity to introduce new plant-based products and have an opportunity to menu that throughout our campuses. Now, when we do that, we're looking at a lot of products. They come to us all the time, and we've actually set up a system for us to review these products with our regional chefs and have a blind cutting, right? So we gather everybody together. We'll try, I think like a couple months ago, we tried over 30 different types of plant-based chicken, and we're testing them on these factors: taste, texture, appearance, smell, and then we rank them. So we go through all of this with all of these different types of products that we're looking for menu gaps for, or products that have these equitable offers within our dining program. You know, we also do a lot of study panels to get Gen Z insight to see where they're at with everything. What do they want to see more of? And we also are starting to dive into, we've done a lot of work around naming products when it comes to whole food proteins and how that looks like on our menus. But now we're starting to take a step back and say, how do we menu the plant-based products and what resonates with Gen Z, whether they're vegan, vegetarian, flexitarian, or a heavy meat eater? What is the most widely accepted menu naming that we should do? So that's a lot of the work that we're doing on the back end.
Thank you. And Scott, a question from you. With Givaudan, you're on the ingredient side. We've talked a lot about taste. We've talked a lot about texture. What innovations on the ingredient side are you seeing to help companies improve the taste and texture of their products?
Yeah, thanks, Keith. We're really excited about a lot of new technologies, both on the protein side, so things like mycelium, which we believe are going to lend themselves to, call it plant-based 2.0. So better taste, better texture, better nutrition, and hopefully even lower costs for the future. So that's one. But even beyond protein, things like alternative fat solutions. So we're talking about taste and texture, and if the fats and oils are bleeding out when you're cooking, it's not appealing. So we're seeing some really cool new technologies coming to us in that regard. On November 1st, we're holding a hackathon. Basically, we're bringing 14 early-stage companies to MISTA, and we're exploring the whole future of fats and oils. So everything from insects to algae to precision fermentation to cell ag and more. We get to see the full stack of technologies that are really being deployed in areas like fats and oils as well as protein. So that's what's really exciting us about the future.
Okay. And Elizabeth, a similar question to you, because Cargill's involved all the way throughout the supply chain. And so there's taste, texture, but there's also the issue of price parity. And can you talk a little bit about where you see that going? How do we get improved taste, improved texture, but also get that price parity?
Yes, thank you. I think we've all kind of identified these big buckets. So similar buckets within Cargill. We're looking at taste and texture and really the whole of that eating experience. Cost is obviously a big bucket, and the health and nutrition. And so when we think about all of these things, they really need to work together. We cannot solve for eating experience to the detriment of cost, and neither can we do any of these other things and have a longer ingredient statement or less nutritious product. So I think as we look at this, we really look at it as a holistic value chain. And so when we think about taking costs out and making this value chain more efficient, it really has been largely based on partnerships and how we can partner across this value chain. Like you mentioned, Cargill's got 150 years in the food business, so lots of opportunity to bring parts of Cargill to bear. So whether it be ingredient access or processing efficiencies, operational logistics, and kind of customer intimacy is a huge one. I think staying really close to the customer. And so these partnerships that can unlock these solutions while still taking into account the cost, it has been huge. And so I think it's a focus for this entire group, and I think will continue to be one that we need to really drive down and to make sure that we can unlock some of these gaps, but doing so in a way that makes this product more accessible to the masses.
Thank you. And Scott, you mentioned a few ingredients. What about processes? Are there processes you see out there that can contribute to the improvement of product quality?
Yeah, we certainly do, and it's process, but it's also leveraging technology where we can. So, as an example, we are just about ready to commission a new extruder at our facility at MISTA to help us understand how these ingredients can integrate together. But the fact is, there are hundreds and almost thousands of ingredients we can choose from, thousands of processing parameters that we have to decide on, and it's literally too much for the human brain. So by deploying artificial intelligence, we believe that we'll be able to then further improve the quality of these new alternative meat and alternative dairy products through the use of artificial intelligence to help us on the consumer adoption side.
I'm glad to hear artificial intelligence will be used for something other than taking over the world, so that's fantastic. Elizabeth, we've talked kind of broadly about the plant-based market and where it can go, but there has been a sales slowdown. And so right now, from your perspective, what can companies do to improve the performance of the products in the marketplace? I know, Neeru, you talked about it a little bit, but Elizabeth, from your perspective, what do you see?
Yeah, I think that these products, we've talked a lot, I think it's well known that there's a gap to the consumer, the consumer need today. And so continuing to focus, I thought Neeru had a lot of great data about things that we can focus on in the near term. I think, again, with some of the cost implications, scale, right? Achieving the scale unlocks a lot of what this category needs. Access to ingredients, functionalization, a lot of the product development work, some volume will unlock a lot of that. And so I think largely the messaging of it too, I think when you think about the growth that this category should be able to achieve, but also how we talk about it with the consumers will be important. I think back, I was talking to one of my colleagues today about just the consumer palate a little bit. We talk a lot about this mimic gap in eating experience. And we were talking about yogurt, the yogurt category by comparison. And I have small children, well, not that small anymore, 11 and 13-year-old. And when I ate yogurt as a kid, it was a much sweeter yogurt. And the yogurt my children eat today is, by and large, Greek yogurt. And I think there's a bit of this category that make that transition too, right? It has so many benefits to it. Is the comparison over time as necessary? So I think it's an interesting thing as you think about some of this messaging that you talked about, that it's not non-meat, but it's pro-vegetables. And some of the benefits versus maybe polarizing the two categories, because like the data indicates, these are flexitarians and these are meat eaters. And so messaging this category in a way that kind of meets them where they are, that fits their lifestyle and values and all of that, I think will continue to benefit the category as we make, it's incredible to see the advancement made in this category by a lot of very, very smart people like you all. And so I think just continuing the product development work, seeking partnerships to help scale, and then understanding that there are so many macro trends really in support of this category.
Thank you. And Jennifer, Sodexo made the commitment to 50% of 50%, make its menus 50% plant-based by 2025. And that's a bold commitment, and it's coming up. So I'm wondering if you can talk about what went into making that commitment, and then also, how are you going to get there?
Well, it is a pretty bold and incredible commitment, and I'm very proud of. The commitment really stemmed from as Sodexo globally, we have a commitment of reducing our carbon emissions by 34%. So that's huge. And we know that 70% of our carbon footprint comes from the food that we buy, so that we have this huge opportunity when it comes to what we menu and how we can make it craveable for students and our other segments to want to try those options. We do know through data that campus is leading the way when it comes to this. So we have an opportunity. Currently, our menus sit at 42% of plant-based entrees on our menus, which I think is incredible. So we're not that far off from the 50%. But how do we do that, right? How do we make it to 42%? Well, we've done a lot of work around it, and there's a couple factors. One that we've just recently done was trying a default veg approach in our dining halls. And we worked with the Better Food for Tomorrow and Food for Climate League and Better Food Foundation. And we did this key study finding with a couple of our accounts, and we tested how the default veg approach goes. So one day you walk up to the station and you have a deconstructed meal, you're getting all the components, and at the very end it is a plant-based chicken. You can certainly ask for the animal meat chicken, however you have to ask for it. It's not there, it's not present. You can fully see the plant-based one. What we noticed was incredible. The key findings from this was normally 31% was the takeaway rate, but when we did the default veg approach, it skyrocketed to almost 82% of a takeaway rate by just simply switching the menus. So that's something that we've incorporated into one of our stations with our menus. We also have 100% plant-based dining stations that we're incredibly proud of. They feature all day parts, so breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It has a customizable approach, so you're thinking you're like grain bowls, more of your whole food plant proteins. And that's fantastic. But what I really get jazzed about is normalizing the plant-based options throughout all your stations, right? Because your vegans and vegetarians, they're going to find the plant-based station. They're going to seek it out. But I'm looking to kind of have those meat eaters come up to the grill station where they have the bacon, the bacon ranch cheeseburger, and they're like, oh, we have a plant-based version. Well, that's kind of interesting. Well, I like that. Let me try that today. So that's where it's incorporating these equitable offers through the other stations, your comfort station, your pizza pasta station, and having that just get normalized so that they see these equitable offers. Another thing that we've done, this is like a lot of fun for me to talk about, is we tried these trial experiences. So we have these fun pop-ups with our students. And again, it's just that exposure of a plant-based product. So I have this little obsession with desserts, if anyone knows me, and I love sugar. So one of the things I wanted to do was to have a fun, crazy milkshake pop-up and have it like with all those toppings, donut holes, candy, you name it. It's like those Instagrammable pictures that you just want just take a picture of. It's almost too pretty to eat, almost. So we made them 100% plant-based. We made 14 different options, and we let our students have a blast with it. They got to vote and tell us what they thought. It was 97% of the students loved it. They actually had 135 of our accounts sign up, and 167,000 of these shakes were devoured. And the feedback was, it was just, you heard over and over again, like, wow, this is plant-based. You wouldn't even tell the difference. This is crazy. This is so good. So once they try something like that, it kind of opened the door as like a stepping stone to say, well, hey, I'll try this crispy Nashville hot chicken sandwich now. It's made with what? Plant-based chicken? Oh, all right. I like the milkshake. Maybe I'll try this. So it's having those experiences and these memorable moments that really open the door for more acceptability with our students.
Perfect. Thank you. AK, we were talking backstage, and you're relatively new in your role at Beyond Meat. I think you said about 6 months ago. And you've come from another food and beverage company. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about your learnings as you've come into the category and as you've looked at the category. What are your thoughts about where it is, and what are your perceptions as far as how we get to growth?
Sure. It's fun. So prior to being at Beyond Meat for the last 6 months, I spent roughly 10 years off and on at Red Bull North America, leading their brand marketing department. And just like at Red Bull, I think that the most important thing that we need to do within plant-based is to be consumer-centric. Focus on the consumer more than ever before, and then work backwards to build out our strategies. Jennifer, you said something really interesting when you talked about actually the default being plant-based. That speaks to an insight, right? We know, at least within Beyond Meat, that the category consumer, 53% of category consumers eat animal protein 80% of the time. we're speaking to a true flexitarian consumer. So if you know that's who your consumer is, then you change the way that you engage them, right? You don't worry about plant-based only stations. You integrate plant-based offerings in places where they can also find meat alternatives, right? And we've seen how that can actually change things. I was in Germany a few months ago checking on my teams out there, and I went to, I think it was a Burger King, QSR. There, the plant-based is a default. You have to ask for an animal Whopper. And that changes the way that a consumer thinks about the category. It changes the way that a consumer thinks about the product when you just make a small change to that outlet. So I love what you all are doing at Sodexo. I also think another really important thing that we need to do is to think differently about how we differentiate our brands. I am shocked to hear that many people believe that Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat are interchangeable. You know, some people, we used to say this back at Red Bull, if you ask the consumer who Red Bull's best friend was, they'd say it's Monster. Not our best friend back then, all right? And Impossible, despite them being an incredible category competitor and a great, great brand, we need to make sure that we're creating differentiation. There needs to be an emotional connection every single time you see that green of the Beyond Meat. And I think there's an opportunity for us to build that association, that positive association that the consumer has with our product. And some of that is a cool factor, right? Wanted to make sure consumers believe that our products are cool or hip, particularly for the younger ones. But then for those millennials, those Gen Xers and those boomers, we also want to make sure that they understand the health benefits, the critical health benefits associated with consuming our products. I believe if we do just a few of these things really, really well, we'll start to see our category start to skyrocket again. Educating consumers about the health benefits of our products, building differentiation between each of our different brands, but then also giving consumers a gift of choice when choosing their proteins.
It's interesting because what you're talking about, and at Sodexo, we're talking about trial, and you're talking about the Burger King in Germany where the plant-based was the default. Neeru, BCG has done some work on trial as far as, I believe you asked some meat eaters, you know, have they consumed a plant-based burger or a plant-based meat alternative? Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from that, what their responses were, and what the barriers may have been?
Yeah, definitely. And in case any of you in the audience haven't seen it, please check out the video. It's in the notes for this panel on the app. So I interviewed a range of people across San Francisco to really get their input on what they like about plant-based products, what they don't, what the barriers are, and what's holding them back. And to your question, Keith, I think the main barriers that people really shared were around lack of availability and options in restaurants, lack of ability to actually sample small amounts of the product before they have to buy it so that it's not really high stakes for them. And some of them also had some questions and concerns about additives and processing. So you're absolutely right. There's a lot of room to really increase trial and also how we guide consumers to pick these choices along the lines of what we were hearing just now. And I think it all kind of goes back to the conversation we've been having, which is who is the target consumer for a certain product? What occasion are they choosing that product for? And also, where are they when they're making this choice? And so a couple of examples of product trial that, you know, to consider. So, for example, if it's a product that's meant to be cooked at home and you need to buy it at a grocery store, then, well, let's meet the consumer where they are and offer some samples at the store. And maybe you pair that with a coupon or a code so that they, you know, buy first time when they're there. That's one option. But in addition to actually just offering the physical samples, I think the grocery retailers themselves also have a role to play in driving trial by where the product's even positioned within the store. So one company that we worked with, they experienced a 40% uplift in sales from placing their alternative protein products in the category versus in a silo with just the vegan products. So cheese next to cheese, yogurt next to yogurt, etc. And so that's another way to think about how do we incentivize trial, meeting the consumers where they're at, and what's comfortable and convenient for them. Then, you know, there could be another occasion, for example, if someone's like dining out and we want to increase trial there, that's a different type of occasion. And so for that, companies can really think about, should we do a pop-up or a collab with a restaurant that fits that target demographic and that consumer segment that we're going after there. So I think lots of different opportunities to increase trial, whether that be samples, whether that be through how we position and guide things, or the default choice, as we just heard. But it all goes back down to who the consumer is and what occasion they're purchasing it for.
Thank you. Elizabeth, Cargill has a broad ingredients portfolio. And as you look at ingredient innovation in the market for alternative proteins, are there any developments you're excited about that you see coming?
There's so much to be excited about across this value chain. So I think ingredients certainly are one of them. When you think about the proteins that are available today and how they can become more accessible and at a cost that is more applicable into this product cost that we're generally talking about, I think there will be ingredient innovation that occurs to those ingredients too. How do we make those more functional? And I think there's a lot of innovation yet to come. I mean, processing technology is a huge category, right? So the ingredient availability today, how do we increase that access, make it more affordable? But also there's a breadth of just innovation that I think this category is doing today and will continue to do. And I think the pace of those things is really exciting. And so, yeah, for Cargill, this is an entire value chain. Everything from ingredients, grain origination, ingredients, formulation. We obviously have a global manufacturing footprint. So it is kind of bringing all these pieces together, but super excited by the work being done in the category and the promise for what's to come.
Thank you. So I've been asking individual questions of each of you, and I want to open it up and just ask you to kind of give your thoughts on a topic. And Scott, we'll start with you. In your mind, how far away are we from price parity, and why?
I think we're within a few years of price parity, and of course it depends on what the technology we're working with. But when you think of scaling technologies like precision fermentation or biomass production, we're getting close. And as was already mentioned, we need additional scale. We need additional manufacturing facilities to help us do that. But it's happening, and we are going to get there. So I think it's pretty close. When you talk about cell-based solutions, we're probably further off to get to price parity. But in certain applications, like fish, for example, when we have no more fish in the sea, price parity doesn't even matter because we're simply out of seafood to get from the sea. So we're going to have to find other solutions there to do that. So in some cases, I think price parity is super important when you're talking about hamburgers and sausages and chicken nuggets. In other things, I think it's less important because people are going to be willing to pay a bit more for products that are extremely high quality. And especially if you're removing things like antibiotics, when you're removing things like pollutants or microplastics. So I think there's some opportunities there.
Neeru, what are your thoughts on price parity?
It's a good question, and I obviously it does vary by segment. I think I'm going to take a slightly different approach here, which is that I think we're on the track together in the next few years, and I think there's obviously lots of scaling and advances that need to be made. But I think if I go back to the consumer research and what really matters to consumers, obviously breaking down some of these barriers like affordability and price is important and something that we need to continue to work on. But I think even in the absence of being able to really solve that here and now, there's so much that we can still do to meet those consumer needs. And I think that gives us opportunity and potential even here and now. So I think whilst cost parity is still room to grow, we can do a lot more on the other consumer needs.
Excellent. Elizabeth, what are your thoughts on price parity?
I think I would echo a lot of what they mentioned on the panel already. I think I'll take another little pivot on price parity. I think there's an element of this that is back to this consumer messaging. there's a lot of category nuance, whether it be, the beef mimic, for example. I mean, beef. So a little bit of history on me. I've worked for Cargill almost 20 years and always in protein. So I've spent the first 17 years in the traditional protein space, most recently led our retail beef business for North America. So a pretty big shift to think about a very mature category and then kind of operating as a startup within Cargill for these last 3 years. So as I think about price parity, I think about it a couple different ways. If I'm talking about beef specifically, beef prices in this country will be at historic highs now and for the next several years as you think about the cattle cycle that we're in. So price parity in beef, that gap should get smaller. There should be a lot of beef mimics that have less of a gap to close. When you think about chicken and chicken prices, those are certainly far more competitive. So mimics there, I think, will struggle a bit when you think about that price parity gap. The messaging and the need for price parity, I think, is very important in how you go to market with these products. If you are trying to mimic the traditional protein, I think that pricing component is very important. If you are kind of taking this shift in the consumer messaging to be very positive vegetables, I think there's a way to message some of the products that come to market where price parity becomes less and less of an issue. The benefits of the product far outweigh maybe the comparison. There's also we haven't gotten much into it today, but blends, when you think about these hybrid or blended products that will either be traditional protein and plant-based or cultivated and plant-based, there will be a lot of that price comparison to figure out within some of maybe these tangential categories that will emerge here. I think all critically important that we message the consumer effectively. There was a different conversation today, but just the nuance of knowing how to talk to consumers about blends. I think we're all talking about how important it is to do in just a strictly plant-based offering. It will become even more important as we think about blending some of these different categories together.
Thank you. And Jennifer, from Sodexo's perspective and price parity, can you talk a little bit about how that fits into your role?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love everyone's insight on this, and I think that there's a lot of good truth in what everyone's saying. For campus, it's kind of interesting because this non-commercial food space that I'm in, where a student, 65% of our business is a student swipes their card and it's an all you care to eat or anything you care to eat facility and environment, right? So yes, price parity has a factor, but it may not be as high as everyone assumes it would be in that environment, because I can menu something, and yes, while it may have a higher price point, I can do a blended average of that day for a plate cost, right? I'm not serving something and someone's paying per price per entree. So we can look at it with like a different lens most of the time. But I'll be honest with you, I think we're pretty close. We're coming to this point where I'm looking at different products, and sometimes it's pretty even with the cost of animal proteins that we're looking at. So I'm excited to see this journey because I think we're pretty close.
Okay, anything you want to add?
Sure. I'm going to have a completely different take than everybody on this panel. I'm a brand marketer. I went to school for brand marketing. The role of a brand is to reduce the primacy of price on the purchasing behavior of your consumer. So when I think about price parity, I'm less concerned with price parity. I'm concerned with cost parity. I'm very interested in making sure that I can minimize my costs so I can maximize my profit. I want that margin to be nice and healthy. My goal is to build a strong enough brand where I can reduce the primacy of price on that consumer's purchasing decision. And we've seen this. It's tangible. We work with QSR partners all over the world. We just had a meeting with one of the largest QSR restaurant chains in the world, and I showed them data that showed the power of the Beyond Meat brand in changing their perception, right? The perception of, I should say, their patrons on their overall brand. We were able to increase their perception positively in regards to sustainability, the perception they were doing something right for the environment, and that they as a consumer were making a good decision on behalf of the environment. So there is a role that a brand can play, and I don't disagree that price parity is an important thing, particularly if you're a commoditized product. But in a product or in a category where brands do exist, I don't want to be on par with ground beef. Ground beef is a commodity. It's been around forever. My preference instead would be to demonstrate the value proposition that my product has so that a consumer can see that value and be willing to pay more for it. And we've actually seen that tangibly, even within retail. So I will say, though, food service partners that we have, like Sodexo, we do work hard to make sure that our price is as close to animal as possible to keep your ingredient costs as low as we can. But at the same time, once that brand is introduced, there is value, tangible value to the consumer for that.
Perfect. So we started at this end. AK, we're going to start at your end. And we've been talking about some negative perceptions in the market, taste and texture. Let's look at opportunity. Can you name a significant opportunity you see in the marketplace? And I'd like to ask each of you as well.
Sure. I think that this category is full of opportunity. We're probably what is animal protein? How big of a category is that? It's probably total protein. Trillions of dollars, right? We're not even 1% of that. So there's a ton of upside. We look at household penetration, the total category is probably sitting about 13%. If you look at total plant-based protein, there's a lot of upside there. A lot of households who aren't trying us, at least on a 12-month basis. Our heavy consumer is eating us twice a week, typically at dinner time. So to the point that Neeru made around occasionality, it's important. We need to be an everyday dinner item. People need to feel good about giving our products to their families. And they should feel good. They're healthy products, they're clean, they're delicious. But I think that's really where the opportunity is to really change consumer perception about the health benefits that our product can provide, as well as the taste bona fides that really do exist. Our products have become delicious and in many cases indistinguishable from their animal equivalents.
Okay, Jennifer, from your perspective.
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach with it, because I think with food service, I think one of our biggest challenges, we have a ton of operators, a ton of different sites and account levels, and I want to make sure that our back of the house, my cooks, my chefs, all of them are understanding why we're menuing this, why it's important to our consumer, giving them the opportunity to have some buy-in, because if they don't have that buy-in, I don't nearly see it on the menu as much. I don't see it giving it the love and attention that they are with an animal protein. I want them to be proud of these dishes and have an understanding of it so that they can speak comfortably and confidently to our consumers, our guests choosing it. So we try to spend a lot of time having training sessions and understanding the samplings with them to give them the opportunity to understand that scope and why we're moving forward and why there is a need and a demand. So I think there's an opportunity there for everybody to grow from the back of the house and get the buy-in at that level.
Elizabeth?
Opportunities, right? Same question?
Yes, please.
Okay. Just want to make sure we weren't going to switch it midway. I think for me it really is about collaboration and partnership. I think there is huge opportunity. Environments like this, right, where you're meeting each other, everyone's kind of forced to share a table and these kinds of things. There are technologies and ingredients and access that exist, and scaling this category, I believe, is very much going to be partnered and collaborative. There are I work at Cargill. There's a wealth of experience that exists in Cargill that I benefit by tapping into, right? I don't have an engineering team or a food safety team or a logistics team, but I have access to all of that. And I think that there is, in the food system, a ton of opportunity for all of you as startups or more experienced companies to partner into really advantaged situations that unlock a lot of things for you and for your business that you don't have to do alone, and the efficiency and the scale of that. I think it's kind of chicken or the egg, right? I mean, this category needs to scale. It unlocks so much from a costing standpoint, from a just product, ingredient access, and all of that. And so I believe that these partnerships might help speed some of that scale as well.
Neeru?
In my perspective, I think the biggest opportunity here is to change the narrative around these products. As we saw from some of that data, the associations and conversations consumers are having about these products is decreasing in terms of the key needs that matter and increasing in terms of complexity and toxins and process. And I think correcting that messaging or changing that messaging and narrative around this is super critical. And I think there's lots of ways to go about it. Some of it is, more industry-wide efforts around changing that narrative on education, etc. But it also goes down to individual companies and how we're talking about these products and actually going back to what really matters to consumers and making sure we're landing those messages.
Scott, what about you? What's an opportunity you see?
Well, an opportunity I see is following the market where it's likely going to go. And this week we had an opportunity to have a discussion with one of our partners, which is Synthesis Capital. And Dr. Catherine Tubb came in and presented to a number of our early stage companies talking about the technology adoption curve. It's a typical S-curve. So in any new technologies, there's always a time where people overestimate the beginning, and I think that's probably where we've been in the last 5 or 10 years, is there was a straight line drawn from where we were to where we think we're going to go in 2030 or 2035, and that's not the typical kind of adoption. So usually it's an S-curve, and so I do believe we are still at the bottom of that S-curve, and that through the work of all of the companies here and the great work of GFI, we will see this. So that for me, the opportunity is still very early, and we will see a massive shift. And we have to see a massive shift. Otherwise, we're not going to have a food system. We're not going to have a planet to participate in. So for me, that's the excitement of what's coming.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. It's come up a couple of times talking about the animal meat industry, and I have some background there. And what people forget is the modern meat industry developed over a century. I mean, we had to create refrigeration. We had to put the railroads in. We had to create the distribution. If you think about plant-based meat, it's happening very, very quickly. And so it's there may be a need for a little more patience, because I think you're right. I think we are at the bottom of that S-curve. And so with that, I'd like to know, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, we do have quite a few very good questions. Some of them were kind of answered as we got through the panel, so I will try to consolidate a few of them or just pick some of the ones that we haven't touched on quite as much. One of these questions came in while AK was talking about consumer insights, mostly in the retail space. It's also relevant for Neeru's discussion about labeling. Was just curious from all of the panelists about insights on food service, how consumers act differently in food service, what the needs of food service operators are, and what some of the opportunities are there.
Yes. Yeah.
I think to me that goes back to having these equitable offers, right? I think there's a nice mix of having these healthier type of products that appeal, especially from like a Gen Z perspective, like in the campus segment that I'm in. But then there's also these indulgent ones where you really want to just go all out and dig right in. But making sure from a campus account perspective, we see it time and time again, our students want to eat the same thing that their friends are eating and going and having a great time and making these memories around a meal. So the closest that we can get our products to whatever we're serving that day, I know I mentioned the Nashville hot chicken sandwich. It's like one of the number one selling things on our campus right now. If we have that and then we have a plant-based version of it, it goes like gangbusters. Like it's incredible. So being able to put stuff like products and menus like that into each of our stations is a huge opportunity for us. And again, to me, on a bigger scale, it's normalizing these types of menued items on a bigger scale.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would say that there needs to be a strong degree of partnership between food service operators and brands or companies that are providing these products. 3 in 10 people enter the plant-based meat category through food service or QSR. In Canada, 6 out of 10 people, or 3 out of 5, actually come in at A&W restaurants on Beyond Meat products. Incredibly important to make sure that we're leveraging this channel to drive trial for our consumer. It's only possible, though, through really good partnership between the outlet, the operator, the food service partner, whatever you want to call them, and the brand, though, because there has to be this exchange of giving the consumer the opportunity to have that choice. And we can only do that through marketing and everything else. But, even back in my old days in beverage, the number one driver of awareness was in-store, right? It's the same thing within food service or retail. Like, we need to make sure that presence is there, the brands are being presented, and then the options are also there for the consumer. So food service is incredibly important.
Anyone else?
Okay, thank you. The next question is specifically about protein powders, but I think we can kind of expand it to plant-based dairy or other categories. But things like animal-based protein powders, and I think you can say the same for plant-based protein powders, have largely avoided some of the scrutiny of being highly processed and unhealthy. Is there anything that the plant-based meat industry can learn from these other categories about how to avoid some of these negative perceptions, even if they kind of undergo similar processes that plant-based meat products do?
I think it's a question around clean. How does plant-based meat avoid the challenge of being considered ultra-processed? Does anybody?
I'll chime in here. I'm not sure I'm the expert on this, but I think it's a continued effort around product development. And I think it is efforts upstream and downstream to have greater functionalization in ingredients and get cleaner label. I think part of it is messaging, like we've talked about, and then part of it is, to the point earlier, like, this is early in the evolution of plant-based meat products. I think you'll continue to see, and there's a lot of investment and effort going into reducing ingredients and making these cleaner label and more nutritious. And so I think time will certainly help solve this. I also think it is the continued effort to message it correctly, make sure that the consumer understands the truth of the health benefits, and then the evolution of the improvement, I think, will really be the thing that continues to gain more and more consumer appeal.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I would say that it's a challenging comparison, right? If I were to open up the doors of our Columbia, Missouri plant and walk everyone in this room through our plant, you would say this is a very clean process. I think the key difference between the consumer's perception versus reality is there's a perception that the product is ultra-processed rather than a process to make the food. And that's the key difference. There's a process, it's not processed, right? There's a process for that animal protein that it has to go through to show up on your plate. And for better, for worse, the plant-based meat industry shows all the products and all the ingredients that go into our products, whereas the animal meat industry doesn't have to show the antibiotics and the hormones that are leveraged in the creation of these products as well, right? So there's perception, there's reality. I think the opportunity that we have as brands and as marketers is to really pull the veil away and be transparent with our consumers. Let them see how the products are made. Let them understand the things that go into the product. And not be afraid to be proud of the products that we have. When you take a look at the Beyond Burger, the only product, or rather the only ingredient that people struggle to understand is that of methyl cellulose. And it's a plant fiber. That's it. But I think we need to educate consumers on what that is. In the hundreds of years that methyl cellulose has been used, there has not been one death attributed to it. Not one. But animal protein is responsible for it's the majority driving factor for heart disease, which is the #1 killer in the world. And it's intensified among different diverse communities within the U.S., right? So I think there's an opportunity for us to maybe shape perception a bit more to the messaging point that you made earlier, because I think there's a difference between perception and reality as it pertains to plant-based meat.
Scott, what about, Neeru, go ahead, please.
I was just going to chime in with one quick note on the health and taste point, which is that I think with the protein powders, feels like that one's very targeted to like a health-based occasion. So you're taking it after a workout or whatever. So it's very clear. When it comes to plant-based meat products, they can have so many different occasions that we're going after. Some of them can be, I want a really healthy meal, but sometimes it can be, I just want a really indulgent burger or whatever that might be at that moment. And so there's a much broader range of different occasions that people are consuming them for. So it's a lot harder to pinpoint one message that you want to land. For some of them, you want to emphasize health. For some of them, you want to emphasize taste. So there's a lot more nuance.
Scott, do you have anything you want to add related to that or the perception of clean?
I think that, again, we're going to see a lot of evolution here in products that do appear cleaner. To AK's point, I think we're already there, but from a consumer perception, if they're looking at the number of ingredients on the label, today we have early stage companies that are bringing some amazing products to market that have 6 ingredients that everyone can understand. So we are making progress. But at the end of the day, these products have to perform in certain ways, and it does take technology, it does take ingredients. If you want your hamburger to cook out in the right way to look like real meat, it takes technology, it takes ingredients, it takes solutions. So it's a combination, I think, of messaging, it's a combination of maybe exploring new ingredients and new technologies in the future. That we're seeing coming online, so I think the sky's the limit. And hopefully, AK, maybe you'll invest some of your money into some extreme sports like you did with Red Bull, and maybe that will change the perception. I don't know. That would be cool.
I will say, though, I do think that there's something to that. There's a restaurant chain in Atlanta, Georgia. They've got locations in New York. It's called Slutty Vegan. And I think what they are doing is really changing the perception of what it means to be plant-based. It's sexy, Pinky, who is the proprietor and owner of that establishment, has done an incredible job of changing the perception and making it cool, making it hip. People go there not because it's plant-based, but because they know that they're going to get great food. And they're going to feel a certain way when they eat it, right? And it's incredibly indulgent. It's not healthy food. Golly, it is not healthy. But it's plant-based. It's delicious. And again, there's a really strong brand that's being built around it. That's
Perfect.
A good point.
Well, we're bumping up against our time, so I would like to give a round of applause to our panel and thank them for their information and their time. And thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it, and I hope you have a good rest of your conference. Thank you.